Hey Starship addicts, my name is Zach Golden, and welcome back to part 2 of our investigative report into the Starship Orbital Launch Mount. The purpose of this 3-part series is to explore the significant obstacles SpaceX has encountered over the first 7 flights of Starship, which up to this point have made it nearly impossible for them to achieve rapid reusability of their launch system, aka Stage 0. In part 1, we reviewed the massive list of protective measures installed on the launch mount prior to IFT-1 to maximize its chances of surviving its first encounter with the world's most powerful rocket. After that, we performed an in-depth analysis of all major refurbishments and repairs required to return the launch mount to operational status, leading up to the second and third test flights. With that said, if you haven't seen part 1, I recommend clicking on this link and starting there first, because it contains a lot of information that will carry over to this episode. Today in part 2, we will continue our analysis of these refurbishments for flights 4 through 7. While some reoccurring problems will finally be solved, by the end, I think it will become clear that SpaceX has legitimately maxed out what is physically possible with version 1 of the Orbital Launch Mount. Alright, with that out of the way, let's jump right back in where we left off. The third flight test on March 14th of 2024 was a big step towards achieving some of SpaceX's core goals for the Starship program. Super Heavy finally lifted off for the first time with all 33 engines ignited and successfully relit the 13 center engines after hot staging. Although it fell just short of completing its full duration boost back burn, it was able to make its first attempt at a soft splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico. Not to be outdone, the second stage ship achieved orbital velocity for the first time and carried out several in-flight tests before taking us on a wild ride during re-entry. While both vehicles ultimately ended up being destroyed, engineers were able to gather a ton of new in-flight telemetry data and quickly began implementing changes to improve performance on the next attempt. But with 328 days, or just under a full year between the first and third test flights, SpaceX was way behind schedule and needed to pick up the pace. Showing a clear sense of urgency, the Stage 0 team wasted no time getting back to work to restore the launch mount to operational status. Just as before, they started off focusing on the refurbishments that would be needed to perform the static fire test of Booster 11. The first item on the list, of course, was the routine replacement of the booster QD flex hoses. This time around, we finally got some confirmation of our assumptions of what was causing the damage. When the shielding was removed, we immediately noticed the liquid oxygen supply hose was severed at the base. Looking at it closely, you can see that the failure point was just below the point where the flexible hose transitions into the rigid cone-shaped flange. Thanks to Ryan Hansen Space, we can visualize the amount of bending that occurs in this area where the hoses are crimped to the flange. Based on the way this failed, it seems like we may have been on the right track with our theory of rapid changes in temperature causing stress fractures in the material. A failure like this could be really bad if it went undetected and the booster were allowed to return to the launch site to land on the chopsticks. It would certainly make things a bit awkward when attempting to detank the vehicle after setting it back on the launch mount. So this was clearly a serious issue that needed to be addressed as soon as possible. Luckily, the Stage 0 GSE team had been studying this problem over the first 3 launches and finally had a plan for how to solve it. But that would have to wait a few weeks, because starting a project that would cause delays to the booster testing campaign is almost guaranteed to draw a yellow card. So, after swapping out the BQD umbilicals and completing the replacement of the Raptor Chill collection pipework, they were ready to static fire Booster 11 just 22 days after Flight 3. This cut the previous turnaround time in half. After Booster 11's successful 33-engine static fire test on April 5th, it was time to take care of the remaining tasks on the pre-flight checklist. The first, and perhaps most important of these items, was to remove the door for the Booster QD and replace it with an upgraded design. The significance of this upgrade may have gone unnoticed if not for the new bulge that was visible on the front of the door. After comparing these before and after images, we can see some new equipment on the back side of the door, which was not present before. Again, thanks to Ryan Hansen Space, we can visualize what's going on here. As I mentioned in part 1, we assumed that the reason these problems were occurring was due to a lack of valves on the nozzles to contain gases inside of the hoses or prevent flames from entering. Instead of making a major alteration to the QD plumbing, they fabricated retractable caps to cover the nozzles after the door closes. Because of the way the door swings into position and the fact that the nozzle flanges extend out from the BQD faceplate, the caps cannot be simply mounted to the back of the door. A separate mechanism is needed to extend the caps into position. For this, they added 2 small hydraulic actuators mounted onto the backside of the new bulge on the door. As you can see, the additional space created by this bulge was required in order to fit all of these extra components in there. After the frame that the caps are mounted to is extended into position, it's locked into place using the same teeth that lock the QD plates together once mated with the booster. One interesting observation is that this design only includes caps for 4 out of the 5 larger injection ports. This includes the LOX and CH4 fill drain ports, the CH4 bleed, and the CH4 pre-press nozzle. The nozzle that supplies gaseous nitrogen to pressurize the LOX tank is left unprotected. This kind of makes sense, because it's the only nozzle that you won't have to worry about leaking gas adding to the fire hazard. Theoretically, this line could also be used to purge the inside of the enclosure with inert nitrogen gas after the door is closed to dilute any combustible mixtures that may be present. There's no way of knowing if this is being done though. In a huge win for the Stage 0 team, this upgrade seemed to completely eliminate the damage that was occurring to the flex hoses during launch. Since Flight 4, we have not seen any more replacement of these components, which has helped to reduce the amount of refurbishment required between launches. Unfortunately, while one problem was being resolved, another surfaced for the first time, this time with the hold-down arms. Just like previous flights, SpaceX needed to replace all of the hold-down clamps again. But this time, after the clamps were removed, they also began removing all 40 of the massive constraining arm linkages. These linkages attach between the top of the hold-down arms and a clevis bracket inside of the launch mount. When the linear actuator retracts the hold-down arms, these linkages fold in on themselves inside of the table. One thing that we noticed when these arms were removed was that the large bushing that should have been on the inside of the lower linkage member was missing. This is the one that attaches to the top of the load arm. You can see what they looked like when they were first installed back in 2021. When you compare the before and afters, you can tell that these have definitely been through some shit. But whether their appearance is a result of a single event or from repeated exposure is a difficult question to answer. Either way, the fact that these bushings are missing is incredibly odd because it doesn't really make much sense to remove it if you're going to be taking out the entire assembly. Beyond that, if you've ever tried to remove bushings from components of your car's suspension, you know that getting them out can be a bit of a challenge without the proper tools. Something of this size would certainly require some specialized equipment in order to not only extract them in place, but to insert new ones as well. Removing the arms from the table and extracting the bushings using a hydraulic press would be a lot more ideal. With that said, I don't think it's unreasonable to consider the possibility that these bushings were severely damaged to the point that they were able to fall out on their own. The type of bushings used in this application are most likely cast bronze bushings impregnated with lubricant. After doing a little online research, it seems like these are typically rated for around 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 150 degrees Celsius applications. Under the right conditions, these bushings can quickly flash melt. Even though they're protected once the hold-down arms retract into the table, they still probably experience a significant thermal load during the 6 seconds between ignition and liftoff. And of course, during static fires, the arms remain exposed for the entire duration of the tests, which can last anywhere between 7 to 14 seconds. Up to this point, the bushings had been exposed to approximately 117 seconds of intense heating from both static fire tests and launches. It's important to note that 32 of these seconds were static fires with less than 10 engines. Another thing to consider is that 40 out of the remaining 85 seconds were performed raw, with no water deluge. So just under 50% of the extreme heat exposure minutes that these bushings had logged were at times where there was nothing to absorb a large portion of the thermal energy from the exhaust. This repeated thermal cycling can damage the exposed components of the hold-down mechanism over time. Luckily, the bushings are somewhat protected by several inches of steel from the constraining arms, so the heat that is able to soak through the steel and actually reach the bronze won't be anywhere near as hot as the exposed surfaces. The only part that will have some direct exposure would be the outer flanges of the bushings. There is a small gap between the clevis bracket on the load arm and the lower constraining arm, so that's why I believe this flange would be most at risk for becoming damaged or possibly even melting. The only good news here is that while the engines are firing, cooler air from above the deck is being sucked down through the space between the booster and the inner wall of the launch mount. But I'm not sure how much that actually helps. Now that we have considered this option, we should also reconsider how this may potentially relate to what's going on with the hold-down clamps. If we look at this image taken by Starship Gazer as one of the clamps was being removed from the launch mount, you can see that it's in similar condition to the linkage arms, roasted. The clamps themselves are likely made of tempered steel, which makes them incredibly strong. It would take a ridiculous amount of heat over a long period of time to undo the heat treatment process that gives them their strength. But what about the hinge that the clamps rotate on when they open and close? On the bottom of the clamp, we can see a hole that appears to continue through to the other side. We aren't certain how this part works, but to attach the clamp to the resting block, there is likely 2 bushings on either side of the hole, similar to what you would find on the average barbell at the gym. Unlike the significantly larger bushings on the constraining arms, which are sleeved into holes with 3 to 4 inch thick walls, the material surrounding these is a lot thinner. So in the same thermal environment that is potentially causing damage to the larger bushings, we should probably expect these to experience the same damage, but a lot faster. If this is the case, replacing the bushings one by one is a time-consuming job, which will require the clamps to be removed. At that point, it's probably a lot faster to just swap the clamps out with new ones and then send the damaged ones out to be refurbished. If only we could track the serial numbers on these things like we do with Raptor engines, we could probably confirm this theory. Anyway, back to the hold-down arm linkages. While part of the reason these were replaced may have been related to the damaged bushings, there was also a noticeable upgrade to the arms to improve their mechanical performance during launches. I think this is actually related to an issue Elon discussed during the Everyday Astronauts Tour of Starbase in June of 2024.
The hold-down arms also change, the launch arms, because the current ones have some potential to bind and grab the rocket, which would be real bad.
Yeah.
So we have a new design for the launch arms that take the load of the rocket and then retract, so that they're not going to bind and potentially cause the whole thing to explode.
Yeah.
I'm really glad he mentioned this, because if not, our interpretation of this upgrade would be far more speculative. So what is he talking about here? What would cause the hold-down clamps to bind up? Well, I think we should start off by clarifying a few things. First of all, this is probably not an issue with the actual clamping mechanism. As you know, the clamps are retracted 11 minutes before launch, so it's not really possible for them to grab onto the booster. Instead, the problem being described here is likely referring to the entire hold-down arm assembly. If this fails to retract, then at minimum, it would destroy the engine shielding. Even if this shielding is removed on future boosters, you would still have to worry about a collision with the engine nozzles. There's literally no room for air. Additionally, when he said that there was a potential for them to bind up, I think the word potential should probably have been swapped out with the word tendency instead. Why? Well, because this issue must have already been observed on several occasions for it to become a major design consideration for version 2 of the launch mount. Luckily, this clearly didn't happen during an actual launch because, as he said, it would probably cause catastrophic damage to the booster. Instead, this is probably something they would have noticed while performing back-to-back retraction tests like this one. The purpose of these tests is to verify that the retraction of all 20 arms is perfectly synchronized. Despite the fact that you can see tons of workers observing the test, confirming that the arms are in sync with each other is not something that can be accomplished visually. Not only is it impossible to watch all 20 at the same time, but the retraction speed is far too fast for the naked eye to detect these variations. In fact, in the process of trying to figure out exactly how fast it is, I realized that the animation we use in our intro cutscene is actually 50% too slow. After syncing the animation with audio from one of these retraction tests, I was able to adjust the animation to the correct speed. Yeah, like I said, it's ridiculously fast. Therefore, the tiniest delay in this sequence can spell disaster for the booster, tower, launch mount, and potentially the tank farm as well. So to achieve the required precision, they use a special device suspended from a crane to measure the retraction speed of each individual arm. I have a super old episode about this, but long story short, when the arms contact the wires, we believe it sends an electrical signal back to the measurement device. This allows them to detect the slightest difference in timing between the 20 arms and make adjustments until the variation is within an acceptable range. This range is probably on the order of a few milliseconds. Alright, now that we've cleared this up, we can address the binding issue. In order to explain what's causing the problem, we need an understanding of how this semi-complex mechanism actually works. Let's start off by removing the 2 constraining arms in the hydraulic actuator. While the main load arm is retracted into the table, it's highly probable that it will naturally want to fall due to the fact that a majority of its mass is on the left side of the pivot point. But when you factor in the mass of the Raptor QD assembly and its mounting bracket, and their distance away from the vertical line created by the pivot point, it's possible that it may actually remain vertical on its own. It's difficult to say for sure without knowing the exact mass of these components. But for the sake of this explanation, let's just say that the load arm would require a small push in order to get it to fall. Now let's see how this changes once the 2 constraining arms are installed. When fully retracted into the table, the pivot point where the 2 linkage members join is behind the vertical line created by the upper pivot point. Because of this, the weight of the linkage arms will naturally push the load arm out towards the center of the table. The load arm will continue falling until the angle between the linkages reaches 180 degrees. Because of how heavy this load arm is, it would likely bounce once it reaches full extension. This is similar to allowing the tailgate on an older pickup truck to fall on its own, except it would be way louder. And this is where the hydraulic actuator comes into play. As we just discovered, the actuator is not needed to force the arm to extend because it will do that all on its own. Instead, the actuator prevents the arm from deploying by pulling it towards the inside of the table. After the booster is lowered into the launch mount, the directional control valve for the actuator limits how quickly the arm falls down to its natural resting position. This stops it from bouncing. Once the booster is resting on the clamping block, the clamps engage and the Raptor QDs are extended out to the outer 20 engines by a secondary actuator. Alright, now for the fun part. It's T-minus 11 minutes from liftoff, Starship prop load is nearing completion, and the clamps have just retracted. At T-minus 2 seconds, the booster QD uses high-pressure gases to spin up and ignite the 13 center engines. 1 second later, the Raptor QDs do the same for 15 of the outer 20 engines, followed shortly after by the remaining 5. At this point, the Raptor QDs are free to retract from the booster, while the flight computer performs health checks on all 33 engines. After deciding that all systems are good to go, the booster immediately throttles up its engines. Inside the pivot point in the bottom of the hold-down arms, there are load cells that function as clevis pins. These actively monitor the load acting on each of the hold-down arms like a scale. As soon as the average value detected by the load cells approaches 0, aka a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1, the arms have just over 1 second to pack it up and get the f*** out of the way. Quick side note, I also have an entire episode explaining how we know these load cells exist, the procedure for calibrating them, and our assumptions for how they're used. So if you want to know where this bit of speculation about what triggers the hold-down arm retraction comes from, then make sure to check that out. Anyway, to consistently achieve the desired retraction speed, there has to be a lot of consideration towards the weight distribution of the individual components and the overall mass balance of the hold-down mechanism assembly. The first thing that improves performance is making the massive load arms as light as possible, without compromising their ability to bear the load of the 5,000-ton fully fueled Starship. This is why the Stage 0 team was so quick to remove all of the heavy shielding from the side of the arms as soon as they deemed the extra protection to be unnecessary. Reducing the weight of the load arms means less force is required to pull the arms inwards, and should theoretically allow them to retract faster. Another way to improve performance is by increasing the mass of the linkage arms. Similar to how the weight distribution of the linkages helps to extend the load arm, they also contribute during the retraction. Because of how the weight is distributed, the pivot points where the two links join together will naturally want to fall downwards and collapse the arms together. But as I explained earlier, the weight of the main load-bearing arm prevents that from happening. On its own, this gigantic arm is probably heavy enough to keep the two arms held in full extension, even if the hydraulic actuators were disconnected. This essentially caused the links to be more or less locked in that 180-degree extended position. As a result, if the actuator begins retracting the arm too quickly before the pivot point starts to drop, the linkages may momentarily resist until gravity takes over. Then, as the linkages fall downwards, they collapse together, which simultaneously pulls the load arm towards the inside of the table. This actually reduces the load on the hydraulic actuator, allowing it to retract faster. With this in mind, while the new constraining links were being installed, we got a great look at some of the new hardware that was added onto both arms. Comparing the old with the new, you can see that 3 counterweights were added onto the linkage members. There's 1 on the lower arm and 2 on the upper arm. Even without knowing the exact mass of each of these components, we are fairly confident of what they're trying to accomplish here. The addition of these counterweights will shift the mass balance between the linkages and the load arms. Ideally, this might be enough to cause the pivot point to sag if the hydraulic actuator wasn't present. In other words, the load arms would no longer reach their fully extended position on their own. Without the hydraulic actuator, they would bounce and then naturally come to rest in a partially retracted state. This means that after the actuator gently lowers the arm into the balanced position, it has to then push the arm the remaining way until it's fully extended. So how does this help during the liftoff retraction? Well, as the booster begins rising off of the clamp blocks, the arms will naturally want to lift up to their partially retracted position. This means that when the command is given for the actuators to begin retracting, the pivot point will have already dropped slightly. As a result, the likelihood of the two linkages becoming briefly locked in their extended position and resisting the initial pull of the actuator will be significantly reduced, if not completely eliminated. Although we have no way of comparing their performance, this additional mass should increase the speed of retraction. Hopefully these animations from Ryan Hansen Space make it easier to visualize how this would help pull the arms into the table faster. Anyway, this explanation has gone way longer than I initially intended. But the point is, I believe this upgrade is SpaceX's attempt at addressing this issue as best they can on the current version of the launch mount. As Allan mentioned, Stage 0 2.0 will feature a completely redesigned hold-down mechanism which will take into consideration the lessons they have learned from the original design. We will hopefully touch on that more in Part 3. To be honest, we haven't quite figured out if this is the real design for the new arms yet because it doesn't really work with the known mounting points in the new launch mount. This is perhaps the one negative aspect of having unprecedented levels of access to the Starship R&D work going on at various locations. We occasionally end up spending massive amounts of time trying to figure out what something is and how it works, only to realize it's a pathfinder or prototype that has little to no resemblance to the final product. But it's always a fun challenge trying to make sense out of the design and engineering that goes into solving various problems encountered during the Starship development process. On that note, if you're the type of person who loves getting a deeper understanding and growing your skills in a fun way, especially in the areas of math, data analysis, programming, and AI, then I welcome you to check out Brilliant.org. Brilliant puts the fun back into learning by allowing you to explore through thousands of interactive lessons presented to you in a way that feels more like a game than a science class. By using a first principles approach, Brilliant helps you build your understanding from the ground up by starting with the basics and then gradually working your way up to more difficult problems. The lessons are filled with hands-on problem solving that help you actually visualize these concepts instead of forcing you to memorize equations. This method of learning has been proven to be 6 times more effective than sitting around watching boring lecture videos where your mind is far more likely to wander. Each lesson is created by an amazing team of experts, including award-winning teachers and professionals from places like MIT, Caltech, and even companies like Microsoft and Google. I think my favorite thing about Brilliant is the way it helps me to make better use of my free time by keeping my critical thinking skills sharp. Whenever I catch myself mindlessly scrolling through social media, I open up their easy-to-use mobile app and either dive into learning something new or refresh my memory on topics that I may have forgotten over the years. It's the perfect way to grow both personally and professionally without feeling like a chore. Lately, I've been really interested in their artificial intelligence courses where you can take a peek under the hood of large language models like ChatGPT to understand the concepts powering today's technology. Needless to say, this platform is amazing, and now you can try everything Brilliant has to offer by taking advantage of their 30-day free trial. Just visit brilliant.org/CSI Starbase or scan this QR code to get everything that Brilliant has to offer. That will also give you an awesome 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks to Brilliant for partnering with us for today's episode. All right, so where were we? Once all 20 of the new constraining arm pairs were installed, the replacement hold-down clamps were mounted as well. Turning our attention back to the external surfaces of the launch mount, one of the final tasks before launch was to beef up the shielding again. Near the end of Part 1, we discussed how before Flight 3, additional burn panels were added to either side of the booster QD. After the launch, Stage 0 engineers inspected the structure and likely noticed that the area adjacent to this double layer of burn panels was beginning to show signs of erosion as well. In response, they added one additional panel on either side, bringing the total number of double-stacked panels to 4 out of 18. I've always found it a bit curious why they didn't just add a second layer over every surface that comes in contact with the exhaust plume during the tower avoidance maneuver, especially since they knew it would eventually become necessary. But the fact that they aren't very proactive with this seems to hint that they're trying to make the original surfaces last as long as possible before adding a second or third layer on top. So with that out of the way, the preparations for Flight 4 were completed in just under 3 months. This is pretty remarkable considering that the GSE team was simultaneously performing a major overhaul of the orbital tank farm. This actually started around the time of Flight 2 when they began installing all of the new horizontal storage tanks, but some of the more invasive parts of this transition occurred between Flights 3 and 5. This topic is definitely worth an episode of its own. Probably even another 2 or 3 part series like this one, considering it requires covering 3 years worth of information. The amount of work that has gone into this is pretty incredible. So if you're someone who's interested in understanding these ground support systems, then make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And be on the lookout for that episode sometime later this year. I considered releasing the first part of that series a few months ago, but I think it makes more sense to wait for them to actually finish the transformation. Anyway, with the Orbital Launch Mount sporting another fresh paint job, Flight 4 took place 84 days after Flight 3 on June 6th of 2024. After Booster 11's successful soft splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico, SpaceX immediately shifted their focus towards preparing for the first catch attempt on Flight 5. This required a massive amount of work to transition the chopsticks from being the world's largest forklifts to actually being capable of catching a booster out of midair. We aren't really going to touch on those upgrades today because, similar to the tank farm overhaul, it deserves an episode of its own. While most of the attention was directed towards all of the work being done on the chopsticks, the Stage 0 team also had to take care of the typical refurbishments. Looking at the launch mount from a distance, it was actually a bit difficult to even tell that a launch had occurred just hours before. The booster bidet system is clearly doing a great job of protecting the structure, for the most part. Similar to the previous launches, a closer inspection of these images from Starship Gazer told a different story. For reasons that we haven't quite figured out, the damage to the wedge-shaped steel panels was a lot more severe than previous launches. You can see that the steel on the leading edge of the deflector got so hot that it actually began to melt. It's possible that this is a result of an increase in thrust at liftoff, but without a few decimal points added to the booster telemetry, it's nearly impossible for us to confirm this. Either way, you may wonder if they can just dial it back a little bit on the thrust to reduce the thermal load on the structure. Unfortunately, reducing thrust means a slower liftoff and increases the time of exposure of the exhaust plume, which would potentially make the problem even worse. In reality, we should only expect the thrust to increase even further. Adding hundreds of tons of additional propellant to the V2 ships and boosters will require more energy to achieve the same thrust-to-weight ratio. With that said, I don't think there's really much that can be done about this without cutting the panels off and replacing them with another alloy of steel that's more resistant to heat. But this introduces the risk of increasing the frequency of cracked welds if the difference in thermal expansion rate between the two materials is great enough. We won't dig into that any deeper though, because it's simply not going to happen. At this point, the flame deflector panels just need to survive long enough for the second orbital launch pad to come online. In the meantime, the welding crews once again had their work cut out for them, shaving down and fixing any cracked welds that were discovered during the inspection. I think this is a good time to mention that these cracked welds are not limited to the flame deflector panels on the legs. I've directed most of the focus towards them because they seem to be the most severe, but in reality, these cracked welds occur spontaneously all over the launch mount. After every flight, you can find workers repairing welds in various locations on both sets of stairs, the slanted canopy sections on the perimeter of the launch deck, and the booster QD hood. It's very difficult to see the work that happens on top of the launch mount, but it seems like the only place they don't experience this issue is with the welds that join the stainless steel burn panels together. On that note, I personally think that some of this repeated repair work could have been avoided if the canopy sections were made of the same stainless steel alloy as the deck panels and the outer shielding. To be clear, I'm not a material science engineer, but joining stainless steel to carbon steel panels has always been a questionable decision to me. But without any supporting evidence, I can only speculate that the difference in thermal expansion rate is probably causing issues in those areas. Overall, while these may be relatively minor repairs, the time required to fix these cracked welds after every launch is a big problem as it relates to rapid reusability. I would say that the amount of thermal and acoustic energy that this structure has to withstand is truly unprecedented. But if I did that, it wouldn't be fair to the SLS mobile launch structure. Anyway, less than 4 days after the launch, while weld inspections were still ongoing, the Stage 0 team quickly removed at least 10 of the hold-down clamps. The fact that only half were replaced is probably an important detail, although I haven't been able to figure out the significance. Oddly enough, Flight 5 also happened to be the last time the clamps were replaced. There is a chance we may have missed it when it occurred before Flight 6 and 7, or there may have been an unknown upgrade that improved the longevity of the bushings. Assuming that was the issue in the first place. Unfortunately, as of this time, we don't really have an answer. To be honest, this mystery is one of the reasons I initially wanted to observe at least 10 flights on Pad A before releasing this investigation. But thanks to the rapid pace of Pad B construction, ain't nobody got time for that. With the flame deflectors and Raptor Chill collection lines repaired, Stage 0 was now ready for the static fire test of Booster 12. But they were going to have to wait. Even though this time around there was no replacement of the booster QD umbilical hoses, the trend of reducing the turnaround time after launch was broken. Because of the somewhat last-minute decision to attempt a booster catch on the next flight, additional time was needed to allow teams to focus on upgrades to the landing rails on the chopsticks and perform catch simulation testing on the B-14.1 test tank. As a result, the static fire did not occur until 40 days after Flight 4. After this, B-12 returned to the booster bay for final outfitting, which included a surgical operation to increase the capacity of its landing tanks. Meanwhile, the Stage 0 team was able to take their time with final launch preparations for once, while a massive amount of work on the chopsticks and integration tower was completed. As far as modifications to the launch mount, the only real change that was observed was an additional burn plate mounted to the top of the booster QD enclosure. I'm a bit surprised this didn't happen much sooner, considering the abuse it takes during the tower avoidance maneuver. But the pattern of new shielding added after each launch might be a good indication of how the rate of ablation varies at different locations on the structure. Ablated material may not be the only concern here though. Even though SpaceX seems to have been successful in their efforts to protect the BQD umbilicals from being damaged, it seems that this was only part of the problem. In the aftermath of every launch that has taken place since the upgraded door was installed, we have seen workers spending several days, or sometimes weeks at a time, working inside of the enclosure. Unfortunately, because there's no way for us to see what they're doing, all we can do is speculate that there are still some smaller components that need to be replaced after each launch. Adding these 3-inch thick panels on top of the hood enclosure should reduce the amount of heat that is able to penetrate through the roof and reach the interior of the structure. This may be enough to prevent some of the sensitive components from being roasted inside of this giant oven after the avoidance maneuver. With this being the first catch attempt of Super Heavy, it was probably even more important to add this extra protection. After all, the last thing you would want is to lose the ability to detank and safe the vehicle after it lands. Beyond that, thanks to the landing burn, there is now additional exposure to the exhaust plume, and unlike the avoidance maneuver, it's not guaranteed to be focused around the booster QD. Based on their simulations, SpaceX knew that the exhaust plume would move rapidly back and forth across the launch deck while the booster is making its final corrections before touching down on the chopsticks. Luckily, with only 3 engines used in the final landing phase, this is significantly less thermal energy than what they have to deal with during liftoff. With this in mind, they didn't feel the need to cover the remaining deck surface with a second layer of burn panels. Instead, they chose to paint the entire deck with the same cementitious paint used on the rest of the structure to help it resist the brief contact with the hot exhaust gases. After 130 days of repairs, upgrades, and waiting for an updated launch license, SpaceX was now ready for the 5th flight test of Starship on October 13th of 2024. This was probably the most exciting launch to date due to the long-awaited first catch attempt of a Super Heavy booster. Oh, speaking of the first catch attempt, I think now is the perfect time to take a step back and mention another operation that gets repeated before and after every launch. Many of you are probably familiar with the booster alignment pins located on top of the launch mount. As the name implies, they are used to assist with properly aligning the booster as it's being lowered onto the clamping blocks. Before the hold-down arms are deployed, the alignment pins are extended to engage the socket on the side of the booster. Once the arms are fully extended, the pins help guide the booster down onto the clamping blocks. There are similar alignment pins used on the booster transport stand as well. A big problem with the current design is that there is no protection system to shield it from the booster's exhaust after liftoff. Left exposed, the ball joint at the end of the actuator would potentially be worn down over time. More importantly, the electronics and hydraulic hoses would certainly be fried in the high-temperature environment. Prior to Flight 1, these were surrounded by steel boxes, but they have since disappeared. So it seems these enclosures may have been intended to shield against brief, relatively low-energy testing anomalies like this, and were not expected to be able to provide adequate protection against 2,000-degree exhaust plumes. So, before every launch, the hydraulic hoses are disconnected and the entire assembly is removed from the mounting bracket. After this, a square plate is welded over the opening for the cables and hoses. After the launch, the plates have to be cut back off and then the 2 alignment pins are returned to the launch mount. The big question that we had leading up to Flight 5 was whether or not SpaceX was going to develop some sort of protective shielding to allow the alignment pins to remain in place. Sadly, that never ended up happening, and when B-12 successfully landed on the chopsticks, it had to be very carefully placed back onto the launch mount. Surprisingly, this didn't take much longer than it does when the alignment pins are used. So, if the chopsticks are clearly able to do this on their own, using a combination of the push pins on the landing rails and the stabilizer arms attached to the lower lifting points, then why are the alignment pins on the launch mount even necessary? Well, because of the gigantic cross-sectional area of the booster, there is a potential for it to sway back and forth a little if there is any wind present at the time of lifting. Obviously, this would create a problem when lowering the booster into the launch mount. Any unexpected movement can cause the engines to collide with the hold-down arms. If you aren't planning on reflying the same booster a few days later, then this isn't really a big deal. Any engines that are potentially damaged after landing can be swapped out for new ones after it's returned to the booster bay. But in order to achieve their goals of rapid reusability, SpaceX will eventually want to address this issue. The process of removing and reinstalling this alignment pin is actually super fast in comparison with the other repetitive pre-flight refurbishments. But by their own expectations, having to do this before and after every launch is simply not an option in the long run. With that said, we should definitely expect some changes to the alignment pins on version 2 of the OLM. After the success of Flight 5, SpaceX was in a massive rush to move on to Flight 6 in record time and repeat their successful booster landing on the chopsticks. So this time around, the only real repair work we saw was to the welds on the legs of the launch mount and of course the replacement of the Raptor chill collection lines. After this, they performed a gorgeous sunset static fire test of Booster 13 just 11 days after Flight 5. This cut their previous best from Flight 4 in half. Ship 31 had already completed its static fire test back in September, which was a full month before Flight 5. So at this point, the only thing left to do was bust out those paint rollers and lather on the makeup. This time, 33 days after Flight 5 and 26 days after B-13's static fire test, Stage 0 and the Flight 6 vehicles were ready for launch. Ultimately, Flight 6 would not be quite as successful as Flight 5 due to the aborted landing attempt by Booster 13. This was a result of damage that occurred to the chopsticks and the comms array on top of the integration tower. Luckily, we did get treated to some awesome daylight landing views of Ship 31 in the Indian Ocean. This finally brings us to the most recent launch, Flight 7, which, for the most part, as far as launch mount refurbishment work is concerned, was very similar to Flight 6. There was, of course, the predictable repair of cracked welds on the flame diverters, the awning panels on top of the launch deck, the burn panels on top of the booster QD, and the replacement of the Raptor chill collection lines. The one other thing I noticed was that there seemed to be a lot of attention directed towards something in the center of the launch ring. Looking at this from the aerial perspective, we can see a circular scaffolding platform along the inner wall of the ring. Now, to be clear, this is nothing new. We actually see this after literally every flight. But in the past, this was an indication of work being done to the inner wall of the launch mount, the Raptor QDs, or the hold-down clamps. With that said, it's possible that the reason we haven't seen any more replacement of the hold-down clamps since Flight 5 is because they are now replacing the damaged bushings in situ instead of completely swapping out the clamps. This is of course pure speculation, but if this theory is incorrect, then that means that there is another major refurbishment operation going on here that we are completely unaware of, which also occurs after every flight. The only reason I mention this at all is because it might be relevant to explaining why the pad reset for static fire testing took 9 days longer than it did during the Flight 6 campaign. When all was said and done, Booster 14's static fire test took place 20 days after Flight 6 on December 9th of 2024. Moving on to final launch preparations, the booster QD was once again the center of attention. This time around, the changes were minimal, but one thing of note was that for some reason, SpaceX decided to delete one of the lower access doors on the east side of the BQD enclosure by welding it shut. I really try my best to make sense out of every change we see, but I literally have no idea why they did that. So I'll move on. Around the upper doors, there was an L-shaped ridge welded around the leading edge of the door. Even though we haven't noticed any damage, considering it would probably be inside of the enclosure, this seems to be another preventative measure to stop the hot exhaust gases from penetrating under the door. Along with this, an additional plate was added between the edge of the large trapezoidal burn panel and the mounting surface for the rear shield. This removes the gap between the two surfaces. I've been expecting to eventually see identical burn plates installed around the upper doors because it doesn't really make sense why the top half of the enclosure wouldn't require an equal amount of protection. There were panels which were perfectly shaped for this area, laying around at one of SpaceX's storage sites near the airport since August of last year. But in recent flyovers, they seem to have disappeared and were more than likely scrapped. So there's clearly been a change of plans. With Pad B expected to become operational sometime later this year, they may have reached a point where they're confident that the current level of shielding will survive the handful of launches remaining before Pad A is demolished. Anyway, with this work completed, Stage 0 was ready for launch 59 days after Flight 6. This was an increase of 22 days from their previous best. Without consideration of other factors, this may initially appear to be a step backwards for the Stage 0 team. But in my opinion, I think they could have easily completed their tasks much sooner and either matched or beat the previous record. For once, they were able to dial it back a little bit and work at a somewhat relaxed pace because it was clear that they weren't the ones at risk of causing delays to the testing campaign. This time around, the delays to the timeline were almost entirely related to vehicle readiness, specifically with Ship 33. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Flight 7 was the debut of version 2 of the Starship, which featured a massive amount of upgrades from version 1. Unsurprisingly, with Ship 33 being the first V2 ship ever produced, the pre-flight preparations took a lot more time. There was several very interesting factors that contributed to this, which I initially planned on diving into, but for the sake of staying on topic, I decided to remove it. So, where does that leave us? Well, first of all, if at any point during this episode you found yourself thinking, "Good Lord, when will it end?" then congratulations, because that means you were subconsciously feeling the point I'm trying to make here. The amount of repeated repair work required for each launch is not only exhausting to keep track of, but it's simply unsustainable in the long run. As it currently stands, the fastest turnaround time that SpaceX has been able to achieve is 37 days. It's true that vehicle readiness has occasionally been a limiting factor, but in my opinion, if the current rate of assembly was any faster, then there's a good chance that they would simply not be able to keep up at the launch site. I think it's fair to say that without the need to perform a static fire test of the booster, in other words, if they were launching a previously flown vehicle, they could easily bring this turnaround time down to 11 days. But I don't think this would necessarily be something they can repeat consistently though. They may be able to get away with it a few times, but eventually it will more than likely catch up with them in some way or form. Of course, this is just my opinion, and I could very well be wrong. Luckily, we will probably never have to find out, because Pad B should be operational long before that happens. Based on some of the comments from the first episode, I think it's important to remind everyone that the first iteration of this launch mount was always intended to be a massive, rapid reusability R&D project from day one. Whether you agree with their approach or not, just like the ship and booster, SpaceX prefers to start with a minimalistic design, figure out what works and what doesn't, and then iterate that design based on that information. Perhaps this is exclusive to SpaceX, but this is undoubtedly a tried and proven method of developing high-performance systems and vehicles while completely eliminating the presence of redundant or over-engineered components in the process. So, in part 3, we will discuss each of the major design changes that SpaceX has made to version 2 of Stage 0. I have a feeling that based on what we've covered in parts 1 and 2, you may already have a much better understanding of why some of the changes that have already been revealed over the past few months were necessary. But the main question we will finally address in that episode, which is what inspired this 3-part series in the first place, is whether or not an interchangeable launch mount is the best way forward to ensure consistent, rapid reusability of Stage 0. So if you don't want to miss that, don't forget to subscribe and set your alerts so you will be notified as soon as it drops. As I mentioned before, I will be releasing part 3 several days in advance for patrons, members of the channel, and subscribers on X. Thank you for your continued support, because it really means a lot to us and we wouldn't be able to do this without you. Once again, I want to give a huge shout out to Ryan Hansen Space for the massive amount of work over the past few years that went into creating the renders and animations used to explain these topics. And of course, thanks to everyone else whose content was used in today's episode. Last but not least, thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this investigation. Don't forget to check out the link in the description to get 20% off their annual subscription. Alright everyone, I hope to see you all in part 3. For now, this is Stage 0 Zach, signing off.